kind of got to talk about.
I really want to talk about it.
Christian states, like government. You're right.
Yeah. So you're talking about like every government in the world, and tell me if I'm wrong, because this is how I'm understanding it. Every government in the world should enforce laws that everyone has to rest on the Sabbath, and everyone has to cast out idols, cannot practice idolatry in any fashion, and they have to put God first.
So
right?
No, that's extreme. I'm not saying that every nation should do that. I'm saying every nation will do that. Because I'm not only a theonomist, Mike, I also happen to be postmillennial. So I was being facetious. I don't think that's extreme. I think you're absolutely right. What you just said is my view. And not only do I think it should be done by every nation, I think it will be. I truly believe it. I think the nations are Christ's inheritance.
So you do think it should be done?
Yes, I do. Should and will. Not just should, but will.
Okay.
So I was being facetious there, but so I don't just think should be. I think it will be. I think the nations are Christ's inheritance, and they are going to be Christianized, and that we are going to have a Christian world. And when I say Christianized, now I'm not saying that each and every individual is going to be a regenerate, born-again Christian. But I do think that the nations, that societies as a whole, in every single nation, will be Christianized. And I think we see this in Isaiah 65. I think we certainly see it in Isaiah chapter 2. I think we also see it in Daniel chapter 2. And I think we see the principle and the theology backing it in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Mm-hmm. And I'll stop because I know you've got probably lots of questions. But yes, to answer your question, yes, right. I think should. And I'd go a step further. I see your should, and I raise you a should and will happen.
So we should, as Christians, we should then, all of us, be working together to ensure that minimally the 10 commandments are enforced through governmental laws across the country. So no sports on Sundays or Saturdays. I'm assuming that you would think the Sabbath is actually Saturday?
No. So okay. Both Westminster and 1689. No, you're right.
That's a side issue, but
but yeah. So both Westminster and 1689, the Reformed view is they're all Sabbatarian, but they would say that the Sabbath has been not removed but renewed by Christ, who is Lord of the Sabbath by virtue of his resurrection from the last day of the week to the first. Is what the 1689 and Westminster Confession say. And
sure.
Of course you can push
and
back.
I won't
on
even.
It, but
I won't even push back on it.
Yeah, of course you can push back on it. I'm just articulating my position. That's where I would stay with the Sabbath. But yes, so the Sabbath, I think nations should observe Sabbath keeping laws.
And then you shall have no other gods before me, mm-hmm. which the only way to really obey that command is to also have God. As you can't just not have other gods before God.
Right.
Obviously, you have to have God. So what would you propose as laws that would enforce that?
That is so insightful. I want to repeat what you said because our listeners need to get it. The only way to keep, because you can preach a whole sermon on that. The only way to keep the first commandment, to have no other gods, is to have God. It's because it's not whether but which. Culture comes from the Latin cultus, worshipers. We're homo worshipers. We cannot help but worship. And if we don't worship the triune God, the God that is, then we're going to worship some other God, even if that God is self. And I would say that's what humanism is: man, the measure of all things. And so right now, this is one of the things that I would say is, number one, I think that Christendom, because we've had it in the past, and I think the solution is not to do away with it. I think there are bugs and features, right? So Spanish Crusades, not our brightest, finest moment, but I think the solution is not to back away, but to press in. I think we need Christendom 2.0, and it's like Christian as this world religion enforced by civil governments, and I would just say it's not whether but which. Look at the alternative. What has secularism given us? I think that Christendom, on its worst day with Constantine and on its worst day, Christendom can't even come close to putting up the death toll numbers that secularism has brought us. Brought to you by your sponsors of humanism and secularism, by Joseph Stalin. Brought to you with Planned Parenthood and 1 million abortions a year. It's not even close. Not even close. And I think people, they're aware, they're just afraid, but what are Americans going to do? Start rounding up Muslims and putting them in internment camps? It's like, nope, that's already covered by China. And it's not because of the Christian worldview. Not speaking of Chinese people, but the CP, Chinese Communist Party, the government is not Christian. They are a secular, atheistic government, and the oppression that we see in the world, I truly believe it's not the fruit of Christianity. There are bugs within Christianity that gets it wrong at times, but nothing compared to anything else. So go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But the question is, my question is, how do you enforce that?
How do you enforce it?
That was my question. How do you enforce that?
So the way that you enforce it is first, you have to understand three sovereign spheres. So there has to be this understanding of autonomous, separate spheres. So the church has been given the sword of the Spirit. My job as a minister of the gospel is the art of persuasion. We've been given the keys of the kingdom. I administer the sacraments of the Lord's Supper and baptism. I preach the word, pray the word, sing the word, and see the word. And the only images prescribed to the church, which is baptism, the Lord's Supper. That's that, and then the keys of the kingdom have been given not just to me, but to I believe the church within my Reformed Baptist view. That's Matthew 18. Tell it to the church, and they get to bind and loose. So that's the idea of what authority, and it also gives me the idea of my jurisdiction. But these three sovereign spheres of the home, the church, and the state, they're not just spheres of human society, but I think we have to understand them as governments. And it's not a hierarchy of the state is above the church and the church is above the family, but it's three parallel governments side by side, and at times their jurisdiction does overlap, and that's what happened with John MacArthur and Gavin Newsom, right? And you got to duke it out and figure out who actually has jurisdiction here. How do we move forward? What do we do? Does the church and its rights, the rights of the saints, in their obligation under God to worship in spirit and truth, trump the concerns of the civil magistrate that needs to protect people from physical harm with whatever, with the deadliest bubonic black death plague that we've ever had. And so, but as far as so first understand three sovereign spheres as three sovereign governments. The next thing that you need to understand is there's a distinction. I think this is what where theonomy gets a bad rap and people misunderstand. There is a distinction between sins and crimes. And the law of God is, James says, the law of liberty. And one of the things that Christianity, as a worldview, a full-orbed, robust worldview, has done in individuals, but then also in states and governments, insofar as it's been applied at a governmental level, is it has esteemed and protected and honored individual conscience more than any other worldview, more than secularism. I mean, we've got the thought police, right? They tried to literally set up like a George Orwell ministry of truth, and then it just got booed and laughed, and then they quit. But the left, I mean, they're trying to govern thought, they're trying to govern speech, all these, and again, it's not whether but which. So how do you enforce it? Your question. The civil magistrate has been given the physical sword, not the church. So the church does not enforce it. Ministers don't enforce it. Fathers in the home don't enforce it. They've been given a tool. They've been given the rod. The church has been given the keys, and the state has been given the sword. The state would enforce it, but at the level only of crimes, not at the level of sin. And what's the determining factor between the two? It's not the two tables of the law. So some guys, that's a John Lockean kind of more of a not a Christian view, like some of the Christian founders, but more of a Unitarian, a deist kind of view that's not, I don't think, is robustly Christian. It loosely comes from King Alfred and these kinds of things, but they want to break up the two tables of the law and say, well, the state can enforce the second table of the law, commandments number 5 through 10, what we are commanded to do as it pertains to neighbor, but the state can't enforce the first 4 of the 10 commandments, which would be no other gods before me, no graven images, do not take the Lord's name in vain, and then remember the Sabbath. And I would say that theonomy is going to say, no, that it is the state's obligation to enforce not just the second table of the law, but all 10 commandments, but at the level of crime, not the level of sin. And one of the determining factors between the two is private versus public. So in a theonomic, let's just say that I'm right, and not just about theonomy, but also post-mill, and all this stuff happens in 100 years or 1,000 years, and we're watching from heaven. My bet, what I'm betting on, I could be wrong, but what I'm betting on is that you would not see a mosque be permitted to be erected. But you also would not see thought police going into people's homes to stop private Muslim worship. So if someone was a Muslim, they could worship privately in their home because the state does not have jurisdiction there. That is not, we are not policing sins in the same way that, looking at the second table of the law, if a man gets drunk in his home, we're not going in, but if public intoxication is a different matter.
do you think the commandment about idolatry was not applied in the home in ancient Israel?
Well, I don't think that it was policed. I don't think that it was enforced, because ancient Israel, one of the beauties of their law is that it wasn't a policing system. That's why they didn't have a bloated state. And it's like, I understand that there was no separation of church and state in the theocracy of Israel. But even in that, see, some of the theonomists, they would argue, and I think I would agree with them, is that there was kind of a division. There were priests, right? There were
okay. Well,
guards.
let me throw something else
Go
out
ahead.
there. So you mentioned the priest. I was thinking about this. I was recently studying stuff for my big series on women in ministry, and it was about the role and function of judges in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And I could try to find the verse, but the Old Testament talks about how the priest would assist the judge in informing them about the law, so they would be better equipped to make decisions. So the judge was like a Supreme Court. When the local city, leaders, they sit in the gate and you bring a case to them and they're like, hey, this is just too tough for us. Like, I don't know, we're going to pass that on up. Or maybe it's an issue between two cities, they pass it on up to the local judge. It could be Deborah. It could be,
Samson,
Elihu. It
Gideon,
could be Samson, Gideon, Jephthah. And they make kind of the Supreme Court decision. Here's an interesting thought. Doesn't that mean that the leaders in the church, studying the scripture, knowing the word of God, are supposed to be part of the functioning of government, so that there isn't this totally independent sphere? Or would you?
I would say that absolutely,
not agree with that view?
Absolutely, but not functioning. I would say that the goal, one of the goals of the pastor is, for one, to feed my sheep, right? So it's not just the seeker-friendly model that it's always focused on lost people, and then you have all these malnourished, starving Christians with 20-minute TED Talk sermons. Like, no, feed my sheep. So my focus as a pastor, I believe my obligation is in one sense, it's to the people of God, nourishing them, feeding them, tending sheep, tending lambs. But there also is a prophetic function, lowercase p, prophetic function of calling out to kings and kingdoms and principalities. Just like John the Baptist said to Herod, it is not lawful, and Herod's not a Jew, but John the Baptist doesn't see him as getting away from this. He's like, this applies to you. It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife, Herodias. And that ultimately causes him to lose his head. The difference, though, is the priests aren't the ones who ultimately get to put someone to death with a sword. I think that the priests go in and they inform the judges. And in a perfect Christian theonomic state, this example that we're talking about, hypothetical example, yes, I think that pastors, ministers of the gospel would be working hand in glove. They would be working in tandem with the state, but still with a clear delineation that they are not a part of the state. But they would be absolutely, they would be honored by the civil magistrate and informing them and educating them on, this is the law of God. Do what is right. Big news, really big news. Our next Right Response Conference is in the works. We've got a number of things already lined up and organized. This is what we got so far. The whole conference, 3 days long, on postmillennialism and theonomy. And the speakers, Dr. James White, Dr. Joseph Boot, Gary DeMar, and of course yours truly, Pastor Joel Webbon. We've got a great lineup. We've got great topics. If you want to find out dates and location and registration and anything else, go and visit our website, rightresponseconference.com. rightresponseconference.com.